אחרי מלחמת העולם השנייה, אז אבא שלי היה בן 11, אז הוא שאל, אבא, סבא רבא של דני, סבא שלי, למה אתה לא חוזר הביתה? למה אתה כל הזמן נעלם בלילה? אז הוא ענה לאבא שלי, אני הולך למחסן של הדוד הנרי ג'ייקובס, זה המחסן הכי גדול בנמל בברוקלין. אבא, מה היה בתוך הארגזים? What was in the boxes?
נשק.
נשק, אוקיי. איפה שלחו את הנשק?
ליהודים מארץ ישראל.
בסדר, טוב.
My father, he was a role model to us. The lesson living in our house was that action, taking a stand, means you can make a difference.
I knew my dad accomplished a lot on behalf of the Jewish people, but as I started beginning on a project, every day it was more and more and more, and I realized that nobody else is doing many of those things that my father was doing. If I write about it and I do a video on it, it could teach other people to do some of the things that my father did, and maybe some other people could possibly save Jewish lives like my father did throughout his life.
Everything in my parents' house was all about the love of Yiddishkeit, the love of Am Yisrael, and nothing was more important than to make Israel a good, safe place.
We read the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. You had the Nachshon, the first one who jumped into the water. Bobby the Nachshon. He was always the first one to jump in the water, to think about the ideas, how to convince the others, and people followed him.
Bobby possesses a combination of rare qualities which theoretically contradict, but they don't. He is very extremist in his views, but he is not extremistic in the relationship with other people who don't agree with him.
One aspect of Bob's personality, I think, that has set him apart from everybody else is that he wasn't a one-direction man.
He never took a position whether to be a Democrat or Republican, because he would always side with whoever he thought was better for Israel.
If it took a Rabbi Schindler who was Reform, who would get the organization to switch from a foreign carrier to only using El Al, he would work with a reform movement. If it was Rabbi Kahana who was going to make sure that Israel didn't give away land, he was going to work with Rabbi Kahana.
I remember that when Meir was in America in 1981, he wrote to me, Bob Jacobs has given us 2 rooms in his office at Rockefeller Center, including a free secretary and free phone calls and whatever else we need. That was exactly what was the best help for Meir at that time.
He was very close with Rabbi Alexander Schindler, who was the leader of the Reform movement, directly opposite of what my father stood for. The fact that Rabbi Schindler attacked Rabbi Kahana openly every place he went, opposed Israeli settlement, did not mean that my father could not work with him on issues such as the Israeli economy. A good example of this would be Rabbi Schindler asked the directors of Macy's to start carrying Israeli products. Macy's started carrying millions and millions of dollars of Israeli products just by Rabbi Schindler talking to them, through my father asking him to do it and following it up. And Rabbi Schindler wrote some of the most praised letters about my father when you would think they would have been arch enemies. He wrote he never saw somebody sacrifice for the Jewish people like my father.
My father always was talking about congressmen and senators,
My goal was to get American politicians to support Israel.
what you could do to help congressmen who are supportive of Israel get elected, help congressmen who are not supportive of Israel not get elected.
Bob realized that it was very important to develop one-on-one relationships with individual members of Congress.
In 1963, I believe Congressman John Murphy was elected. He was Staten Island and Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. He knew very little about Israel, but he came to speak at the Jewish Community House of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. My father wrote up 10 questions. They gave the questions to the people who were going to ask, and the congressman had no idea why they only asked about things relating to Israel and Jewish causes, and he didn't ask about the environment and other subjects. Congressman Murphy didn't know much about Israel, but he knew that there was a decent amount of Jewish voters, and he just let my father handle it for him. And then my father became both his liaison to the Jewish community of Brooklyn and Staten Island. All of Israel's planes that they used in the Six-Day War and the Mirage came from France. And after the Six-Day War, de Gaulle got into a big fight with Israel and started boycotting.
And at that time, France had refused to deliver the Mirages to Israel.
My father was very upset about this, and he did two major things. He helped organize in the United States an embargo where Jewish stores, chain stores, not to carry French products, and he would get people to order French products and then return it.
I worked with Senator Scoop Jackson, Congressman Murphy, in order to get Phantom jets to Israel.
My father spoke to Congressman Murphy about France not sending the Mirages, and they met with Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, who was a colleague of Congressman Murphy. And they went to President Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson agreed, okay, we'll send them the Phantom F-4s. Those Phantoms eventually saved Israel in the Yom Kippur War. My father specifically would be upset when Jews would go against Israel to try to bend over backwards to be liked. In 1978, the U.S. announced the sale of 60 F-15s to Saudi Arabia. My father, he was very upset at many of the Jews who forgot that Saudi Arabia had sent troops and weapons into Syria in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Senator Ribicoff voted for the F-15s to Saudi Arabia. And my father just didn't understand how a Jewish senator like Ribicoff could vote for weapons to Saudi Arabia when Lowell Weicker, the non-Jewish senator of Connecticut, voted against the weapons to Saudi Arabia. Congressman Stephen Solers was the Jewish congressman from Flatbush and Boroughbrook, which is the largest Jewish district in the United States. He would worry about every cause but Jewish causes. He would call for sanctions against South Africa for the treatment of the blacks. But when it came to sanctions against Russia because of the treatment of the Jews, he wouldn't do anything. When Carter was attacking Israel, he would never, ever, ever attack Carter. And my father thought that Steve Solers should worry about his own people. We did a sit-in in his office in Brooklyn. I'll never forget how Congressman Solers told my father, "Why are you picking on me? All of the other Jewish congressmen are the same." Eventually, Solars ended up fighting for Syrian Jewry and fighting for Soviet Jewry, and then writing these nice letters to my father. I can never know why. I guess it must have been easier for him to fight for Israel than to fight with Bob Jacobs. My father had a particular vendetta against Henry Kissinger.
Even though Henry Kissinger was Jewish, I realized he was an enemy of Israel.
He grew up in Germany. His parents were Orthodox Jews.
He became so assimilated and anti-Israel, turning away from his entire Jewish upbringing.
The State Department issued a terrific blast against the treatment of Jews in the Soviet Union.
Oh, we stopped that 10 years ago. We did that little.
But all, you know, I'm Jewish myself, but who are we to complain about Soviet Jews? You know, it's none of our business how they treat theirs.
And then when he became Secretary of State, he was bending over backward to support the Arabs. And my father felt that Jews in the Yom Kippur War died because of him, and that's why he organized protests everywhere Kissinger would go.
I was there with the oak tags and magic markers, with Kissinger needs a new bris.
I remember posters in the house saying, Mohammed Ivan Kissinger.
Mohammed for his love of the Arabs, and Ivan for his love of the Russians. In 1976, Ford was running for re-election, and my father wanted him to get rid of Kissinger. My father did two things. Yeshiva of Flatbush, which my father was a board member of, they invited Gerald Ford on October 12, 1976. My father wrote a letter that he could speak, but you have to protest against the weapons that were given to the Arabs by Ford and Kissinger. Yeshiva of Flatbush told my father you can't protest against him, and my father answered that Yeshiva of Flatbush is a center of Holocaust studies. Isn't the center teaching us never again? If we know that these weapons are going to be used to kill Jews, you're telling us we're not allowed to protest? We're obligated to protest. Silence killed 6 million, and it's not going to happen again. And my father organized a protest. When Ford came, they had youth effigies of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, big signs, no weapons to the Arabs. The head of Ford's campaign was a Jewish man, Max Fisher. My father wrote a letter to Max Fisher stating that he should tell President Ford if he gets rid of Henry Kissinger, he could probably get him a lot of Jewish votes from the swing states. If he doesn't, they may end up voting for the unknown Jimmy Carter. Ford would not get rid of Kissinger, and many Jews voted for the unknown Jimmy Carter, who my father later found out was also against Israel.
Getting a glimpse of Jimmy Carter.
Carter was running for president the first time. Once Carter was in power, we saw how he really disliked Israel.
Carter was an enemy of Israel. We had to make sure that he would be defeated.
It didn't take long for him to show his colors as a true supporter of the PLO by appointing Andrew Young as his ambassador to the UN.
So the first thing I remember is my dad coming up with the slogan, "A vote for Carter is a vote against Israel." And here he was a one-man show talking in the house, "A vote for Carter is a vote against Israel." He started printing up signs, "A vote for Carter is a vote against Israel." He tried to get kids from Brooklyn College to put up the signs in all the Jewish communities. He rented a van to go through the Jewish communities saying, "A vote for Carter is a vote against Israel."
He was to wear a black yarmulke that was printed in white letters, "Dumb Carter," that made interesting news in newspapers all over.
Members of my family were very supportive of my father because my father had an agenda that was not going to be influenced by anybody, any which way.
I remember my father hearing, "We need to have a rally." Because my father at the time believed rallies are the way to get your message across, where you do something small, but you get publicity and that grows big.
Our job was to make billboards and oak tags and make sure that that be seen. My mom would buy the materials to do the banners. We would be happy to go to these rallies, and we didn't know any other way.
Carter's reputation was going down in the polls in the Jewish community, so he organized to have two of his Jewish aides, Strauss and Linowitz, to a meeting with the Jewish community at the Harmony Club, and my father organized a rally. So we get to the rally, and there was a nice few hundred people there. And
my mom would be there too. My mom was a dynamo mom. She's just amazing what she can do.
That night, Bob, who was invited to be a representative at that meeting, chose to stay outside and asked to go in to be part of the press conference. The guards at the door said that he was not allowed to go. As he was walking away, a cop that weighed about 300 pounds took Bob and threw him to the ground and stomped on his head. Another cop took a billy club and cracked Elliot's head open.
I was screaming at the cop, "Stop, stop, that's my brother, that's my father." And the cop said to me, "You are lucky that's all we're doing to them."
That led to them being arrested and being held over to trial.
They wouldn't tell us where my father and brother were being taken. We finally found out what hospital, and when I was able to peek through, I saw my father sitting there like this. And at that moment, I understood that things are really scary, because my father never sits quietly with his head down. And it turns out my dad was very seriously injured. He has complete amnesia. He had headaches for many years as a result.
Bob would not drop the charges against the police. The compensation that they received at that time was $62,000.
If one wants to understand the critical role played by Senator Jesse Helms, one has to go back to 1985.
Jesse Helms was the most anti-Jewish senator in the United States.
Very anti-Israel and an isolationist. Hated communists, but also hated Israel. He called for Israel to withdraw its troops from the West Bank and give it to Jordan. In 1983, he called on the U.S. to break diplomatic relations with Israel because of the war in Lebanon.
Bob had business in North Carolina. Bob's lawyer was a political disciple of Jesse Helms.
Through my lawyer, Buzzy Stubbs, I eventually made a connection with Jesse Helms.
My father, at the time, he was very worried that because Senator Helms was so close to the new President Reagan, that he could, not only could he convince President Reagan, there were close to 12 other conservative Republican senators. And my father said, this guy, Senator Helms, could persuade the other conservative senators. Says my father has nothing to lose. He drives down with Buzzy Stubbs to Senator Helms' office. They meet with his other advisor, Tom Ellis. And according to Buzzy, my father and the senator hit it off.
It was simple. Jesse Helms became aware of right-wing conservative Jews that shared more in common with him.
He believed that all Jews were left-wing Democrats.
He thought all Jews were like Kissinger and Steve Sollers, and he was very impressed that his sons had a sit in the liberal Congress in Steve Sollers' office.
Through these common values, they bonded and created a friendship that lasted the rest of their lives.
Then they talked about the war in Lebanon, and Senator Helms had no idea how Israeli soldiers risked their lives to save the Lebanese Christians from being massacred. After that, the senator never said a word against Israel, but he didn't do anything for Israel at that point.
I was a young member of Knesset, and one day he calls me, we had common friends, and he said, "Look, Michael, you have to come to New York." I said, "How?" He said, "We have election in Israel." Doesn't matter, you have to come to New York, and then I'm taking you to Washington to meet one of the greatest opponents of Israel then, Jesse Helms. And I couldn't say no to Bobby. You cannot say no to Bobby Jacobs. And I was in Washington, And we met not only Helms, but a group of senators, including Orrin Hatch, Mattingly, Chick Hecht, and others.
Senator Helms mentions to my father that he's going to be in New York next week, and my father asks him, would you like me to pick you up from the airport? And the senator says, if it's not a bother, and says, can you take my colleague, Senator Chick Hecht of Nevada?
Both senators came to New York, and my husband Bob always picked the senator up at the airport. Why? You have private time. When you're in a car, you could talk to the person and nobody else is going to interfere.
The valet parked it and they invited him up, my father up to the room. Senator Hecht said, Bob, I want to show you something. And Senator Hecht opened up his hand luggage, and inside was a pair of tefillin. And he says, I'm not religious, but I bring them with me everywhere I go.
And after he met Bob, once a week he called him and said, Bob, first time I answered the phone, he said, Bob, is Bob there? It's Chick. The only Chick I knew was the Senator of the United States. He said, what's important for Israel today? And every week he called him, and the full time that he was in the Senate, he was proactive for Eretz Yisrael.
Then by 1985, my parents and Senator Hecht took Jesse Helms and his wife Dorothy to Israel.
Bobby Jacobs convinced him to take time out and visit Israel.
It was private. He didn't want to work with foreign officers, so he was my guest.
He spent most time traveling around Judea and Samaria and the Golan Heights, realizing the vital importance of those areas not only for Israel but also for the United States.
And his reaction was that he became more to the right than Atria, which was to the right of the Likud.
Coming back to Washington, it was a very different Senator Jesse Helms.
And Dorothy became very close to my mom, Elaine. And once the wives became close, it changed the whole picture. I still don't think my father could have gotten this done without the work of my mother and the senator's wife.
And then he became chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So he did enormous help to Israel all the years. Bobby kept the contact with him, and what he did for Israel in those years, you can actually attribute all of it to Bobby Jacobs. But because when he took me to Washington to meet Jesse Helms, all New York was against it. How are you going to meet this anti-Semite and this anti-Israeli guy? You are crazy. And then it was a total turnabout in 1 week, and the New York Times came out with a headline, a turnabout in Helms' attitude towards Israel.
He became from a lukewarm, critical senator on Israel to one of the leading pro-U.S.-Israel cooperation senators on Capitol Hill, largely because of Bobby Jacobs, who in many respects was Senator Helms' guru on anything to do with U.S.-Israel relations. In 1995, in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords, Israel was about to give away the Golan Heights.
Rabin and Clinton thought the only way to make peace with Syria is if Israel withdraws from the Golan. Rabin agreed to withdraw from the Golan, but he was a man of security. He needed troops to separate Israel and Syria.
Some 10,000 American soldiers on the Golan Heights in order to ensure the peace process.
Rabin did not accept UN troops because in 1967 the UN troops just walked away, and in the war in Lebanon, anytime the UN troops, which is called UNIFIL, anything that would happen, the United Nations would blame Israel. So Rabin asked Clinton if he could put American troops on the border between Israel and Syria. My father found out about it, and he worked with many people, including your Mettinger and others.
I decided to dedicate few weeks on Capitol Hill in order to shed light of reality on that decision.
My father told Senator Helms about American troops on the Golan, how it's a danger to the United States. American soldiers will be at risk if they're over there.
And the point which Senator Jesse Helms understood very well, and especially because of his friendship with Bobby Jacobs, was that a giveaway of the Golan Heights would not bode well for America's own interest.
My father then spoke to Congressman Ben Gilman, the chairman of the Congressional Foreign Relations Committee.
My grandfather organized the protests down in Washington, sent buses, and instead of taking the kavod of organizing the protests and speaking, he took me up to Congress, and he saw Ben Gilman, who was a congressman from the Muncie area, in the hallway. And Ben Gilman was not in support of what my grandfather wanted at the time, and just starts yelling at him in the middle of the hallway of Congress. If you don't do A, B, and C, I'm going to get Kennedy Jr. to primary you, and this will be the end of your career. Like, this is it. If you don't listen to me on this, and this topic. And then afterwards, Ben Gilman used to email my grandfather whenever an issue on Israel would come up because he scared him so much.
Congressman Gilman, somebody who my father did not get along with and then became friends, and there's a letter that the congressman sent to my dad during the days of Ha'amim HaGolan, and everybody was frantic in Israel that we're about to give up the Golan. How could this possibly be? And there's a letter that he writes to Bob. Dear Bob, don't worry. America will not send troops to the Golan. You have my word. I just don't know when is the appropriate time to start the hearings. Is it too soon or too late? But he was on board with this whole issue.
And Helms went back to Clinton and told him that we need to have congressional hearings, otherwise there can't be U.S. troops on the Golan. President Clinton then went to Secretary of State Warren Christopher, who went back to Rabin and said, we cannot guarantee U.S. troops on the Golan, and the whole thing just stopped. והיה להם רוב נגד החיילים האמריקאים בגולן, אז רבין לא העביר את ההסכם לצדרת מהגולן, ואני חושב שזה אני רוצה להגיד תודה לאבא שהולכים לחופש בגולן.
זה מה שהוא אומר. בלי הסבא של דני, יכול להיות שהגולן היה בידיים סוריים.
I remember as a young activist in the Betar youth movement getting phone calls from Bob with ideas what we should do in order to protect Eretz Israel. Bob was there, not only with advice, but with real support.
He was always as strong as could be as a Zionist and as a nationalist, that every inch of holy Jewish land is holy Jewish land, and Hashem didn't give it to us to give away.
So I will continue to take from Bob his passion, his commitment for the people of Israel, for the land of Israel, and not to be afraid from the public opinion, not to be afraid to be a minority, but to do what's good for the Jewish people.
If we had more Jews like Bob Jacobs, we'd have a lot less problems in the Jewish world and the Israel world. That's for sure. Now, he was one tough guy.